Hi, my name is Morgan and I'm a neuroscience researcher, and welcome to Neuro 101, a new series I'm starting. If you're the type of person who hates long intros and like listening to the backstory and the reasoning behind the video, you can skip to this timestamp. For everyone else, I want to talk a little bit about what inspired this series. So several months ago, I got an email from someone asking me if I had any recommendations for learning the basics of neuroscience. And for anyone watching who might be wondering the same thing, I do really recommend the channel 2 Minute Neuroscience. I will put a link to them in the description. But as much as I love them and admire what they do, I don't think it's really a great place for beginners to start, because you sort of have to know what you're searching for in order to learn it, if that makes sense. So I didn't really have any great recommendations for that person, and I actually never responded to their email. So if you're seeing this, I am so sorry, but you did inspire this whole series. When I got that email, and honestly for the last several months, I was going through a pretty extreme burnout period. So burnout is something that a lot of people experience in all sorts of different industries. For people who work in research facilities like myself, or who work for universities, it's pretty common to experience a lot of burnout because of sort of the way that we basically work ourselves to the bones, then go through a period of burnout, take a little bit of time for self-care, and then restart the whole cycle. That sort of behavior is very normalized in research, which I don't think is a great thing, but it is the way that it is. So while I was going through this burnout period, I was looking for some ways to sort of spark some joy, because I love neuroscience. I love learning about the brain, and really my frustrations and my burnout is with the industry that I'm in, and with how research is conducted, and with how universities conduct research, and not with the learning about the brain and with neuroscience itself. But I was starting to project those feelings onto neuroscience, and even just thinking about brains just made me really upset. So I kept on thinking back to that original email, and one thing that I am extremely passionate about, and one of the reasons why I started this channel, is teaching people about neuroscience. And so I decided, you know what, maybe this will help me get out of my funk. I can be the resource for people to learn very basic beginner neuroscience. And throughout the process of researching this series, it really did help me regain my love for neuroscience, because the stuff I'm going to be going over in this Neuro 101 series is all of the stuff that initially made me fall in love with the brain, and all of the stuff that I love. Very basic science, very basic neuroscience is truly what I'm passionate about, and learning the in-depth inner workings of our brain. So I'm going to be teaching this Neuro 101 series as if I were teaching a class of people who may or may not have had high school biology. You do not need to come to this with any knowledge about the brain. All you need to have is some curiosity. These videos will build upon each other. So if you're watching one of my videos later in the series and you're that word is not very basic, that word doesn't make any sense to me, it's probably because I explained it in a previous video. If there's something that I talk about and you'd like to learn more about it, I will oh, my cat is in the shot. If there's something that I talk about and you would like to learn more about it, and you'd like to go more in depth, I will try to include links for more information on each of the topics in the video description. Also, throughout this series, I'm going to be using a variety of resources, like my handy dandy whiteboard, which I'll draw stuff on. I have some little plushies that I'll use to show things. These are from Giant Microbes. This is not a sponsorship. I genuinely love Giant Microbes, and if you have any scientists in your life, or if you're interested in science, I highly recommend them. They have plushies for just about anything you can think of. And then I'll also have some homemade stuff. Sorry, he has something rattling around in his brain, I guess. But I made this out of a Halloween skull. So if you see something, you're wondering where I got it, either I made it or it's from Giant Microbes. Last thing I wanted to mention, my goal is to post these videos weekly. Right now I have 10 videos planned, so hopefully I'll post one every week for the next 10 weeks. And then in the future, just as I come up with stuff that I'd like to talk about. But if you have been following this channel for any period of time, you know that I'm not great with posting schedules. I've tried to do that a lot of times in the past. So once a week is my goal, but I make no promises. So now that the intro's out of the way, let's get on to Neuro 101. Alright, so this is the very first lesson in the series where I'm going to be talking about brain anatomy, otherwise called neuroanatomy. This part of neuroscience is pretty foundational for me being able to talk about the other topics, because I will be referencing different brain cells that might be in different places and things like that. So It's just important to know generally how the brain is structured to be able to talk about the brain. So to start us off, this is a brain, or at least this is my drawing of a brain. This is a bit more accurate to what a human brain looks like. But the brain is very large and it has many different parts that do many different things. And so to make it easier to talk about, people have divided it into different sections. Sometimes those sections are based on what that part of the brain does. Sometimes it's based on how it's shaped. Sometimes it's based on what types of cells are there. It can really just depend on what the goal of naming that region was. So in this video, I'll be talking about some of the most commonly talked about brain regions. That way, like if you're reading like a pop science article and they reference like the frontal lobe, you can know what's going on. But by no means will I be able to cover every part of the brain. Each of the sections that I talk about are broken down into smaller sections and then into even smaller sections and then into even small. Like it just keeps on going down like a little Russian doll. So there's no way that I could possibly make a video about every single part of the brain. So the first way that we have split up the brain is into three main sections. There's the cerebrum, which is this big area, the main part that if you think human brain, it's probably the main part that you're thinking about. Then there's the cerebellum, which is this sort of like ball structure on the back of the brain. And then there's the brain stem, which is the stem. So the cerebrum is split into two halves. You can kind of see that here. I'll put up a better picture here because it's kind of hard to see. But it's split into two halves that we refer to as hemispheres. So you have your right and your left hemispheres. For the most part, your brain sides mirror each other. So what's happening on one side is likely also happening on the other side. And the structures that are on one side are also on the other side, but there are some exceptions to that. And before someone asks it in the comments, yes, there is a difference between your right and your left brain, but it's not whether or not you're creative. I do plan on one of these Neuro 101 videos being myths about the brain, and that's a pretty big one. So back to the cerebrum, it's split into these two hemispheres. For the most part, the hemispheres are very similar to each other. And what happens in your right hemisphere tends to control the left side of your body. And what's happening in the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. Again, that's a general statement, but there are exceptions to that. So some things that your cerebrum does. Again, it's the main part of the brain that you think of whenever you think of a human brain. So when you think about the stuff that the brain does, like thought and movements and consciousness and talking, problem solving, emotions, that's happening in your cerebrum. But movement is actually a really interesting topic because that's going on all throughout most of your brain. So if we move down to your cerebellum, movement is also controlled by your cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum has a special place in my heart because I think it's one of the coolest looking parts of the brain. And I'll put up a picture here of these structures that exist within the cerebellum that are called the arbor vitae, which, if you know Latin, means the tree of life. And they're mostly involved in sensory information, like touch. But mostly I like them because I think they're really beautiful. Your cerebellum is also responsible for balance. Now, the last of this, like, three main sections of the brain is your brainstem. The really big thing about your brainstem is that it's what connects your brain to your spinal cord. So without a brainstem, our brain would not be able to communicate with the rest of our body. But the brainstem also has its own responsibilities like hearing and movement, hand-eye coordination, and a lot of what you might think of as basic body functions like your heartbeat rhythm and your breathing and things like that. Now, before we move on to the next set of structures, I want to talk about all of these little squiggly lines. You see them on every depiction of the brain, and if we look at a real human brain, it also has all of these like big folds and dips, and it kind of looks like cord, like wound in on itself. And if you look at other brains, like a rat brain, it doesn't have all of those folds and all of the squiggly lines. So you might be wondering, like, what are they for? So these are called sulci and gyri. The sulci are the folds, the little dips inwards, the squiggly lines that we see. And the gyri are the top bit, the ridges. And in the human brain, they sort of serve two main purposes. And the first one is to expand the surface area of the brain. Now, I am not a mathematician or a physicist or anything like that, so I will not go into detail on what surface area is, but basically it just lets our brain pack in more neurons into a smaller space. And the other one is that it helps us distinguish different brain regions. Now, when our brains were evolving, it didn't on purpose go, hey, I'm going to develop these so later humans can look at it and know which brain regions they're looking at. But it is very helpful that it happened to turn out that way. So the cerebrum of the brain has 4 lobes, and that's the next way we're going to divide this up. So this fold comes down here, meets up with this guy goes out here, this guy comes in here, missing one, and this guy comes out here. So now there's 1 lobe, 2 lobes, 3 lobes, and 4 lobes. And this is not by any means a perfect drawing. I will put up a better picture here. That was just to demonstrate how the sulci and gyri help us identify the different lobes. Back here, sort of up at the top, in the back of our head, is the parietal bone, and underneath it is the parietal lobe. So the different lobes are actually named for which part of the skull they sit underneath. So even though we usually think about the skull as one bone, when the skull forms, it's actually multiple bones, and I can talk about that in different videos if people are interested. The important thing to know is that the brain sits underneath 4 main parts of the skull. So here in the front, where our forehead is the frontal bone, and underneath it is the frontal lobe. And then back here, sort of where our ear is, or right above our ear, is the temporal bone, and underneath it is the temporal lobe. And then lastly, on the very back of our head, sort of the bottom-ish of our skull, is the occipital bone, and underneath it is the occipital lobe. Now you might notice this giant hole right here, and I will talk about that towards the end of this video. So to sort of go through the different functions of these lobes, the frontal lobe, which like I said sits right behind your forehead, is the main one that's associated with thinking and consciousness. But it's important to say that we don't fully understand consciousness yet, and so we can't say, oh, consciousness only lives in this one spot. It's just the main spot we think of right now. It's also responsible for things like attention and concentrating on things. We also usually associate the frontal lobe with our personality because there have been a lot of cases in the past where people's frontal lobes have been damaged, and the people who knew them before and after the accident say that they had a very severe personality switch after the accident. One example of this is Phineas Gage, who I do have a video on that I will link somewhere up there. Next up is the temporal lobe, and this guy's the easiest to understand because, like I said, he sits right behind our ear. So if you think really hard about what a part of the brain near your ear does, the temporal lobe does hearing. It's also really closely associated with our understanding of language, both being able to speak it and being able to understand what other people are saying. The temporal lobe is also associated with memory. So moving on, the parietal lobe is sort of up here and towards the back. And that's really associated with a lot of your sensations like touch and also knowing where you are. Not just being able to give directions to someone, but also if you close your eye, you should be able to know where your hand is, and that's your parietal lobe. And last but not least, we have the occipital lobe, which, like I said, is in the very back of your head. And it's sort of the hardest one to understand what it's doing, intuitively, because your occipital lobe is actually associated with sight. So there are tracks that go from your eyeballs all the way to the back of your head to help you see. So those are sort of the main ways that we divide up the brain, but now I'm going to talk about some smaller brain structures that you might just hear pretty commonly in popular science. So I'd like to talk about what they do in general. But something that's really important to keep in mind throughout this whole series is that there's no one part of your brain that only does one thing. So even though we tend to think of certain brain regions as oh, that's the brain region that lets lets us see, it can also do other things. But it would take approximately 1 million years for me to go through every single thing that every single brain region does, so I'm just going to cover the most popularly talked about ones. So the first brain region I'm going to talk about, and one of my favorites, is the hippocampus. So the thing that I love about the hippocampus is that it is named after seahorses. So in Greek, hippocampus means seahorse. What's interesting about this, and we're going to go into a bit of a mythology tangent, is that like the people who named that region of the brain saw that there was a Greek word for seahorse and were like, yeah, this brain region is structured like a seahorse. Like the seahorses that you can go see in an aquarium. The fun fact about this is that a hippocampus is actually a Greek mythology creature that is sort of similar to the concept of a mermaid, but instead of being half human, it's half horse. So it's not so much a seahorse in the way that we think of the ones we see in an aquarium, but a horse that lives in the sea. And of course, this brain structure is not even remotely shaped like a horse with a mermaid tail. So the hippocampus is located in the temporal lobe, so sort of like over here, and it has a bunch of different layers, and all of these layers do a bunch of different things. The main thing that we usually think about whenever we're talking about the hippocampus is learning and memory. And it can also be involved in producing different emotions and our behavior when we're feeling different emotions. Another thing that's really cool about the hippocampus is it's one of your only brain regions that's still able to produce new brain cells after you've reached adulthood. I'm going to make an entirely different video on how brain cells are made because that takes a really long time to explain. But long story short, we used to think that you're only making new brain cells when you are a newly forming human. So like children, their brains are still developing. They are still forming new brain cells. But clearly that stops when we become adults, right? We're like fully matured. We're done developing. But no, you're still generating new brain cells in your adulthood, just it's limited to certain regions. Next up is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for keeping your body in what's called homeostasis, which basically just means it's balancing all of your different hormones and neurotransmitters, which are things that the brain uses to communicate with itself, and like your temperature and your blood and things like that to just make sure that your body stays alive, essentially. It also is responsible for things like hunger and thirst and a sex drive and all of the things that you think about as like natural instincts. Your hypothalamus also makes a lot of your hormones, and throughout this series, I want you to keep in mind that whenever I talk about hormones, that's not a dirty word. Like we tend to think of people as being hormonal and that being a bad thing, but everyone has hormones and they're doing different things at different times and they're very important. And as you can probably guess, will be their own video. So we have the hypothalamus, but we also have the thalamus. And you might notice those two words sound very similar. And the reason is because the word hypo means below. So the thalamus is right above the hypothalamus. So it's literally just the hypothalamus is literally just the brain structure that is below the thalamus. The thalamus is responsible for sending a lot of your senses, like the different things that you're hearing, seeing, smelling, to the important brain regions where they're relevant. And it's also responsible for movement. You might notice a lot of parts of the brain are important whenever it comes to movement. And that's just because even though movement is something that we think of sort of subconsciously, it's actually really complicated. And so a lot of the brain needs to be involved. All right, so you know how I was talking about hormones when I was talking about the hypothalamus. The other part of your brain that is important when it comes to hormones is your pituitary gland, which you've probably heard about in all of those ads that are trying to sell you testosterone, which you don't need, by the way, or you probably don't. Talk to a doctor if you think that you need it, but you most likely don't need it. Your pituitary gland basically sits right behind the bridge of your nose. It's just right back there, and it makes all of the hormones that your hypothalamus doesn't. And it's important for sending those hormones out to the different places where they belong to help keep your body functioning the way it should be functioning. Now, I can't make a list of popularly talked about brain regions without mentioning the amygdala. So I study things like stress and learning, and so to me the amygdala holds a special place, but not a good special place, because I think we give the amygdala a bit too much credit and a bit too much attention when it comes to our emotions. So if you've ever heard about the amygdala, you've probably heard people talking about how it's the main place where our emotions happen and where we feel our emotions. But the amygdala isn't the only part of our brain that feels and deals with emotions. A lot of different brain regions deal with different emotions. There's no one brain region that has happy, sad, mad, all of the emotions together. For the most part, those different emotions are more due to hormones and to neurotransmitters than they are to any specific brain region. And something that I thought was really interesting whenever I was researching this video, even as a neuroscientist, I was always told the amygdala deals with all of your emotions. But actually, the only real emotion we have evidence for the amygdala being responsible for is fear. The amygdala plays a big role in our ability to read people's facial expressions, but mostly when it comes to being able to tell if someone else is afraid, or if someone else is angry and we need to be afraid. Most of the evidence for what the amygdala can do just says that it's responsible for sensing danger and not happiness or any of the other many emotions. Okay, I'll step down off my soapbox now and talk about the striatum, which is a brain region that I study whenever I'm looking at things like stress and emotions. The striatum is actually a very broad term for a lot of different brain structures. And because of that, it's involved in a lot of different things. But importantly, it's involved in things like learning and making voluntary movements and making decisions. And like how I was talking about the amygdala being a good place for sensing fear and sensing danger, the striatum is really important in sensing rewards and pleasurable things. Another sort of really broad brain region is the cortex. So if you're looking at a brain like this, for most of the other regions that I've talked about, I can point to different spots on the brain that are that brain region. The cortex is sort of more difficult to wrap your head around, and I do mean that pun intentionally, because it is the whole outside of the cerebrum. It's just this thin outside layer of your brain. And because it wraps around the whole brain, it's involved in most of the things that your brain does. But usually whenever people are talking about your cortex, they're talking about things like thought and decisions and intentional actions. I know I've been throwing a lot of brain structures out there. The very last one I want to talk about is the corpus callosum, which is probably not one that you've heard about if you're not very into brain science right now, but it's a really important region, and honestly I think it has a really fun name, corpus callosum. So earlier I mentioned that the brain is split into two hemispheres. Those two hemispheres need to be able to talk to each other somehow. If we're going with the thought that the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, how do you make coordinated movements? How does your brain know what the other side is doing, what the other side is seeing and sensing? That's done through the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is just a giant bundle of axons. Don't worry, we'll talk about what axon is in a minute. But it's a giant bundle of axons crossing from one side of the brain to the other to communicate what the sides are doing to each other. Okay, now I said the corpus callosum is made up of axons. And you might be saying there like, Morgan, you said this was Neuro 101. What the heck is an axon? Don't worry, that was just my very cleverly planned transition into talking about brain cells. So I promise you we will get back to talking about axons, but for a second, I just want to talk about brain cells in general. This is a cute little brain cell. Notice that I keep on saying brain cell. You might be like, aren't brain cells just neurons? No, they are not. Because if neuroscientists are anything, it is confusing. So the word neuron literally means brain cell, but not all brain cells are neurons. So there are two main types of brain cells. There are neurons and then there are glia. Neurons are the main thing that we talk about when we're talking about brain cells, when we talk about different brain cells communicating with each other and stuff like that. We're normally talking about neurons. But I do want to take a second to appreciate glia. Here's a picture of some of the different types of glia. They are very beautiful, very pretty, and they're the structural support of the brain. And in the past, we thought all that they are is the structural support. And that's the main reason why we only talk about neurons instead of also talking about the glia, because we're like, they're just there to hold everything together. But a lot of recent research has gone into showing that actually the glia can do other things, and they can be involved in the brain generating thoughts, movement, ideas, things like that. So the glia are very important to our brains and to our brain structure and to the different things that the brain does. But we won't be going into them that much in this series. So back to talking about neurons. Like I said, this is sort of a depiction of a neuron. And what I drew here is sort of our basic idea of a neuron. If you ask a neuroscientist to draw a neuron, they're going to draw something like this. There are many different types of neurons. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and I am going to make a whole video on just like how neurons are made and what they do and how they do it, how they work, and the different types of neurons. That will be its own video, but I do feel like it's important to get a little bit of that information into this video. So neurons are made up of three main sections. There's this little bit at the top, this little circled dude. That's called the soma, or the cell body. It's where the nucleus is. Then there's this long boy, also this long squiggly line, and that is the axon that I was talking about earlier. And axons can be teeny, tiny, short, or you have an axon that runs all the way from the top of your spine, the back of your neck, all the way down to your feet. The axon is what's sending information to and from the cell body. And last but not least, you have dendrites, these little guys on the end. So most neurons will only have one axon, but they'll have many dendrites. And the dendrites are used to collect new information. They don't usually send information out, but they can collect some information and bring it back to the cell body. While we're talking about the structure of neurons, I think it's important to talk about gray and white matter because, again, if you've been on popular science media, you've seen a picture of an MRI, anything like that, you've probably heard someone say, oh, this is happening in gray matter, this is happening in white matter. What is that? So really, it's just talking about which parts of the neuron are there. So gray matter is where the bodies are, and then white matter is where the axons are. And that's all it is. It's not that complicated. I don't fully understand why we decided to make it that complicated. All right, so the very last thing I wanted to talk about in this very first Neuroscience 101 episode is the stuff that's around the brain. Because when we talk about neuroscience and when we talk about brains, people tend to think about just the brain. And don't get me wrong, like, brains are important. Brains are the main thing that neuroscientists study. But the stuff surrounding the brain can sometimes be just as important when it comes to how the brain functions, and especially when it comes to things like brain injuries. So the first thing to talk about here is the meninges. The meninges is basically a sac that surrounds the brain to protect it from the outside world. And if you've heard of things like meningitis, that's what they're talking about. It's a swelling of the sac that's around the brain, which can cause your brain to get squished. The meninges is made up of 3 different layers, which don't really matter a ton, but something that I thought would be interesting to mention is that there is the dura mater is the very outside layer. It's the furthest away from the brain. And once, whenever I was doing an outreach event, we had a piece of the dura that people could feel, just to get kids interested in science. And there were a set of kids who refused to touch it and were like, that looks gross, that looks icky, I don't want to touch it. And this one very brave kid came up and he was like, I'll touch it for the group. He stood up for the group and he touches it and he immediately goes, it feels like slime. And everyone else ran and wanted to touch it because kids are obsessed with slime. So if you take nothing else away from this video, the meninges feel like slime. The other really important structure that surrounds your brain is the skull. The skull is all around your brain. This is really important for three reasons. The first reason is your skull is sort of the limiting factor to how big your brain can be. Your brain can't get any bigger than the skull because your brain is nice and soft and squishy and the skull is very hard. Your skull is also obviously very important in protecting the brain. It can protect the brain from most trauma injuries. But depending on the type of injury, your skull can actually make that injury worse. And this is something not a lot of people think about, but I've talked about it very extensively on my TikTok if you want to go check it out. Basically, the inside of your skull is not just a nice, smooth, round circle for the brain to sit in. It has a bunch of dips and ridges, and it's very textured. So while yes, it does protect us from if someone hits your head really hard, they're not gonna squish your brain. They're not gonna touch your brain. But if you, say, get into a car accident and you get really bad whiplash, your head goes forward and then back, and it doesn't touch anything else. Nothing has touched your skull. You have sent your brain sort of let's say this is the front of your skull. Your brain has gone flying and hit the front of your skull, and then it goes flying backwards and hits the back of your skull. And it can actually cause injury on both sides of the brain because of that. So your skull is really important. I think it would be a lot worse if we didn't have the skull, but it can do damage sometimes. And the very, very last thing I wanted to talk about is this hole that's in the back of your head. So this big giant hole in the back of your skull is called the foramen magnum. And it is the hole that lets your spinal cord, your brainstem, come through to the rest of your body. So all of your brain is protected or not protected by your skull. Sorry about that. So most of your brain is protected by your skull, except this very little bit of brainstem that goes out of the foramen magnum and then turns into your spinal cord. So that's all for Neuro 101 today. Like I said, I'm hoping to be posting these videos once a week, at least until I hit the 10 initial videos that I have planned. But again, I'm not the best with a posting schedule, so just keep an eye out. If you have any requests for neuroscience topics that you'd like for me to cover, you can leave them down in the description. And if you're interested, you can check me out on social medias. I'll have them all listed here. I'm the most active on my TikTok. You can see me as a person. Recently, I've been posting a lot of stuff about learning to make chainmail, but also sometimes I post stuff in the lab and about neuroscience. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!